Shalom Aleichem. Welcome. Today is Yom Hamishi b'Shabbat, or actually now it is Leil Shishi, the evening, the beginning of Yom Shishi Friday, which will be therefore Kaf Beth B'Chislev Toshin Peheh, according to our calendar, corresponding to the 11th of December 2025, according to the Gregorian calendar. We are in Hilchot Kriyat Shema Perek Gimel in Mishneh Torah of Rambam. Rabbeinu Gadol Rambam Zal writes as follows: Halacha Aleph, HaKoreh Kriyat Shema, Kriyat Shema, Rohes Yado b'mayim kodem sheyikra. Which means very simply that you are hayav to do Netilat Yadayim before reciting Kriyat Shema. I won't go into all the details now. I will state, and there's no question this is the view of the Rambam and others. I think the earliest source that I have found for this opinion, that for Kriyat Shema alone, without tefillah, without Shmoneh Esrei, that one is required to do Kriyat, to be notel yadayim, to wash one's hands with a cup, exactly as one would do for tefillah. I think the earliest source that I found is Sidur Rav Amram Gaon, and as I have written in the footnotes and Makorot, etc., for the Sidur, I prove there that this is not the mashma'uth. This is not the simple meaning of the sugiyot on the subject, where Netilat Yadayim is required for tefillah, but not explicitly for Kriyat Shema. And in fact, you can find some proof for this in a number of sugiyot. One example I will mention is the following: in the Baraita, in the Talmud, it states, and the Rambam brings this as well, that if a person is, let's say, he's employed picking fruit, and he climbs into the tree in order to pick the fruit off the tree. He's working for the owner of the orchard or what have you. When the Zaman for Kriyat Shema comes along, assuming, let's say, he began very early when it was still dark, he reads Kriyat Shema whilst in the tree. He doesn't have to come down. He doesn't have to come down to the ground, even though it's slightly precarious, perhaps, being in the tree, and nevertheless he can read Kriyat Shema being in that situation. Or similarly, a person building involved in building a house, and he's on top of a wall or whatever on the roof, he's allowed to read Kriyat Shema in that situation. Doesn't have to come down. Whereas for tefillah, he does have to. He cannot say tefillah Shmoneh Esrei, which requires more focus and less distraction, and not being in a precarious situation is not satisfactory. When it comes to tefillah, he has to come down to the ground, etc., in order to recite tefillah, that is to say, Shmoneh Esrei. And yes, he has to wash his hands before he does so. But having come down to the ground, he would have to wash his hands with a cup with water, as one does for, shall we say, eating bread, before davening. But for Kriyat Shema, he reads the Kriyat Shema in the tree. Does he do Netilat Yadayim in the tree? There's no indication of that. It's very unlikely. It's unreasonable to suggest that that's the intention. That's what's going on. So that's one example that I brought there, where I wrote that this I think is a later opinion, which came about in the time of the Geonim, because from the Talmud itself it doesn't seem this way to me, at least. And this is also what you can see in the Tosafot. It may have something to do with the Girusa and the Talmud also, but then too I would tell you that the change in the Girusa was probably also a later emendation. At any rate, Rambam's opinion is HaKoreh Kriyat Shema Rohes Yado b'mayim Kodem Sheyikra. It's important to point out, and I will go over to Hilchot Barachot for a moment. Perek Shishi, Halacha Aleph. Rambam here says, Kol ha'ochel hapaf shemevarachim aleh hamotzi. If you wish to eat bread which requires the bracha of hamotzi, tzarich netilat yodayim tehila wasof. Okay, so you have to wash your hands. We know that. We won't go into the details of that now. In Halacha Bet, Rambam states, Kol hanotel yado. Whoever washes his hands, in other words, a situation where you are required to wash your hands, to what we call netilat yodayim, such as when eating bread, as was mentioned in the previous halacha, or davar shetibulo b'mashkim, as Rambam mentions in the previous halacha also. Kol hanotel yado ben la'achila, ben l'kriyat Shema, ben l'tefila, v'varech b'tehila. So Rambam says you first recite the bracha asher kiddushanu al netilat yadayim, shazo misvat hachamim, etc. Okay, so you see here that Rambam equates netilat yadayim for the purpose of eating either bread or davar shetibulo b'mashkim, or Kriyat Shema or Tefillah. So here again you see that Rambam's view is that Kriyat Shema definitely requires Netilat Yadayim, as Tefillah does. But, as I say, I do not think that is actually the original halacha, as we see it formulated and as it seems quite clearly from various sugyot in the Talmud. But for Tefillah, there's no question that's the case. I'm discussing only Kriyat Shema right now. And Rambam continues. Rambam says, Higia zman kriya, v'lo masa ma'im, lo yahil kriyatha, v'yolech levakesh ma'im. So if it's now zman kriyat Shema, and you have not got water available, you do not put things off. Ela mekaneh yado ba'afar, or bisror, or v'kur'a, v'chayosed v'hen, v'kur'a. In other words, you rub your hands either in some soil or gravel or on some pieces of wood or something to scrape off anything that may be on your hands, and you read Kriyat Shema without Netilat Yadayim.
Could this be connected to the requirement to wash one's hands before learning Torah in the morning, even without a bracha?
I'm not sure that you can make that connection, because I'm not sure that you can find an explicit and clear-cut source for what you just suggested. That in order to study Torah, you said in the morning, correct?
Yes.
But even so, in the morning, let's say a person woke up, did not have to go to the bathroom and studies Torah. Is he required to wash his hands? I'm not aware of any explicit source to that effect. What it says in the Masechet Barachot and the Bavli with regards to Rav, it says that he woke up in the morning and he relieved himself and washed his hands and then began to teach them Torah. It doesn't say anything beyond that. So I'm not sure that you can come up with any such clear halachic statement or formula that Talmud Torah by itself requires Netilat Yadayim, nor do you see this in the Rambam here or anywhere else, as far as I'm aware. Rambam speaks about Kriyat Shema, yes. Rambam speaks about Tefillah, most definitely, and everyone basically agreed when it comes to that. And we see this also, as we know, with regards to Ma'im Rishonim and Ma'im Aharonim. But the Talmud Torah Bilevad, I don't think there is such a source. Look, it doesn't hurt to do Netilat Yadayim, but I certainly do not think that there's any room to be Notel Yadayim Bivracha if it's only for the purpose of studying Torah. On the other hand, it's clear if one's hands are truly dirty, then one should not study Torah in that state. That's true, but it's not the same as saying there's a chovah to do Netilat Yadayim for the purpose of Netilat Yadayim. A person could claim, and that's what perhaps you were driving at, that there is it's a reasonable corollary of saying that you have to wash your hands for Kriyat Shema, to say that also the same is true for any Talmud Torah. There is some logic in that claim, but that claim, as I'm saying, is based on the assumption that there is in fact a clear chovah to do Netilat Yadayim for Kriyat Shema, which I don't think there is, not from the Talmud, not from the Baraita. from at least some of the Geonim? The answer is yes, and the Rambam follows that opinion, as we see. All right, halacha beth en koreim lo bevet hamerchas, or bet hamerchetz, as some would say, v'lo bevet hakiseh, af al pi she'en bo tho'ah. So there are places where one may not recite Kriyat Shema or study Torah for that matter, because yes, it's true. Often these things are entirely analogous and comparable. So one does not recite Kriyat Shema in a public bathhouse, or a mikveh, shall we say today, is perhaps the more likely scenario. In other words, we're talking about a place where people undress, etc. In such a place, one does not recite Kriyat Shema. En koreim lo bevet hamerches v'lo bevet hakiseh, af al pi she'en bo tho'ah. Here we're talking about an outhouse, which may be even brand new. In other words, a place, a shack was built around a pit in the ground that was built, etc. It was dug out, but it's never been used. So that's what it means. She'en bo tho'ah. It's what's called a bet kiseh hadash, which is discussed in the Talmud. So, but once it has been assigned for that purpose, hazmana milothahi, when it has been assigned for that purpose, it's not ra'ui lazkir sham divrei kedusha. It is not proper to mention anything to do with the Torah in such a place. V'lo bevet hakevaroth, and also not in a cemetery in general. V'lo b'sad hamet asmo, even if it's not in a cemetery. In other words, it's a person passed away, has not yet been buried. He's kept in this room. And a person is even sitting with him and being what's called being a shomer. If he's sitting right near the corpse, the meth, he's not allowed to read Kriyat Shema or study Torah. So this is true also in the Bet Kevaroth. In other words, there may be a general area which is assigned as a Bet Kevaroth, but in practice you're quite some distance from any grave. In which case you're allowed to read Kriyat Shema there, but not when you're next to a grave. A person who read in a place where he was not allowed to read has to recite Kriyat Shema once again, with the brachot once again. Halacha Gimel. Beth hakiseh hadash shehuchan wa'adayin lo nishtamshu bo. So this is what we referred to before in the previous halacha about a beth kiseh she'en bo tho'ah. Rambam here explains it more in detail, because here in this halacha we are distinguishing between a beth kiseh hadash shehuchan, it's been set aside, it's been assigned for this purpose, wa'adayin lo nishtamshu bo. It has never been used. And here we're not talking about reciting Kriyat Shema inside it, which is asur, as we already said in the previous halacha. In the previous halacha we saw en korim lo bevet hamerchas wa lo bevet hakiseh af al pi she'en bo tho'ah. Here we're talking about kenegdo. In other words, standing opposite it. Let's say you're standing opposite it, a few yards from it, shall we say. Aval lo bethocho. Even though it's new, you're not allowed to recite Kriyat Shema inside it, as we said already. But opposite one may do so.
So if one has a door open to the bathroom, a modern bathroom, which is clean, they're allowed to say Kriyat Shema in front of it.
It's a good question. The Chazon Ish writes at some length about the kinds of toilets that we have today. And in the Talmud you have the concept of Beth Kiseh de Parsa'eh, which we won't go into all the details now, but the Chazon Ish does discuss that. It's even perhaps better than that. So if it's clean, it might be. The question is whether such whether we should not consider a modern toilet, shall we say, a room in which there is a toilet. Kenirdo, that would be perhaps like today it would be considered like a hadash, because there's nothing there. You have this device, you have this installation, whatever, but it's not. There's no tzo'ah, there's no excrement in evidence. So it's just. In which way is it different from a bathtub, a clean bathtub, or a sink where you wash your hands or something like that? So I would say it's not clear that it would be asur to recite Kriyat Shema, even if you are sort of opposite the door of a toilet. If it's as far as you know clean, and there's no reason to think otherwise, then I would think it's more similar to Bet Kiseh Hadash, and which we now see is Mutar Likrot Kriyat Shema Kenegdo Avalo B'tocho. Merhas Hadash Mutar Likrot B'tocho. A merhas is considered less objectionable than a Bet Kiseh, and if it's never been used yet, so at this point it's just a room. It's just like any other room. It hasn't yet doesn't receive that status of a merhatz until it's used for that purpose, mamash. Which seems to be slightly different from what was said about a bet kiseh, where even though it was huchan, but it was not used, it's already asur. Hayu shnei batim. If there were two rooms, zimen echad mehem lebet hakiseh, u'amar hasheni wazeh harei hasheni safek im hizmino or lo hizmino. לפיכך אין קוראים בו לכתחילה, ואם קרא יצא. This is a safek which is discussed in the Talmud. If we already said that hazmana milatahi. So setting aside a room for that purpose is already considered an act which confers a certain status on that room, on that place. If a person said this with regards to one room, or one spot, or one shack, let's say we're talking about outhouses, and he says, "Wamara sheni was there," and this one too, it's not 100% clear whether that counts as a hazmana or not, as the Talmud discusses there, and therefore it's a safek, and therefore lechatchila one does not read there Kriyat Shema or study Torah there, obviously. And with the Abad, if one did so, he does not have to repeat Kriyat Shema. Amar v'ramzeh, however, if the person said v'ramzeh, then this one is also harei shnehem mezumanim u'en korein b'hem. In that case, they're both considered to be mezuman, and Kriyat Shema may not be read there. Hasar hamerhatz. Now the courtyard outside the bathhouse. This is an area where people are not undressed. In other words, people may they may remove their shoes there or something, but it's not. They don't undress in this place, or they may put their things in this place or something like that. But it's not like the bathhouse itself where people undress and then bathe, etc.
Would this be like in a modern public building? There's an area where people wash their hands and mirrors, and then the actual bathrooms are behind stalls.
I think a place which is separate from where you have a room or a section which is where the toilets are, but it's cut off by a door from or very separate. Even maybe there's not a door, but it's very separate from the area where there are toilets. And here is only sinks for washing hands or what have you. Lichora, that has the same status as what we're referring to here. Yes, as the hasara mirhas. All right, halacha dalet. V'lo kriyat shema bilevad ela kol inyan shehu midivrei kodesh. Asur lo'omro bebet hamerhas u'bebet hakiseh. Anything to do with Torah may not be spoken or discussed in these places. Wa'afilu amaro b'lashon hol, even if one is not mentioning or discussing these things in Lashon HaKodesh, even if it's in another language. From this, by the way, from this statement, you see that there is an intrinsic kedusha in Lashon HaKodesh itself. ולא לאומרו בלבד, אלא אפילו להרהר בליבו בדברי תורה בבית הכיסא ובבית המרחץ ובמקום הטינופת, והוא המקום שיש בו צואה ומרגליים אסור. So here we have a new concept, a new halakha, and that is that not only reciting or discussing Torah is asur in these places, even hirhur, halev, is asur. This is the clear opinion of the Talmud Bavli. Interestingly, the Talmud Yerushalmi states otherwise, that hirhur is mutar and dibur is asur. Interesting discussion in itself. Much has been written about it, I think, but we won't go into all that any further length. And as we said, and we see here, Makom Trinofef is any place where you have excrement, urine, etc. The place is ma'us. Any place that is ma'us is not a place to recite Kriyat Shema or to study Torah or anything of the sort. Nevertheless, here we have an interesting statement. Devarim shelahol. Things which have nothing to do with Torah, necessarily. Nothing, obviously, to do with Torah. Mutar lo amram b'lashon HaKodesh b'bet HaKiseh. One is allowed to discuss them in Hebrew, b'lashon HaKodesh, b'bet HaKiseh. So we said before that in the previous halakha we saw that there seems to be some intrinsic kedusha in Lashon HaKodesh, but that intrinsic kedusha is only fully expressed when it's being used for the discussion of Torah. When it's used for the discussion of something entirely mundane and unrelated to Torah, that kedusha, however we conceive of it, is somehow, shall we say, is like a gene that's not fully expressed. And therefore you can discuss all manner of things in Hebrew wherever one may be.
Does modern Hebrew qualify as Lashon HaKodesh for this?
I have no doubt that it does qualify. I cannot see how anyone could claim otherwise. What argument could you make to suggest that what you refer to as modern Hebrew, whatever, spoken Hebrew today, how could one make the claim rationally that it's not Lashon HaKodesh? Now, if a person says, well, many people who speak Hebrew today, they use all kinds of slang terms, that may be. But that, and I'm not necessarily in favor of that, but certainly not of all forms of slang or what have you, but that doesn't change the fact that the language is Lashon HaKodesh, and it doesn't change the fact that there are many, many Pesukim in the Tanakh that the vast majority of Israelis who've never seen a Tanakh even, unfortunately, would understand. Because, why and how is it that they understand it? Let's say we're referring to Pesukim from from the various places in Tanakh, and the various Sefarim of the Torah, or the Nevi'im, or the Ketuvim, where it's relating a certain event rather than some much more turgid and dense and highbrow Hebrew, as you might find in some of the Nevi'im, in which case many Hebrew speakers may not be able to make very much headway in understanding necessarily all the words there, or the meaning. And that has nothing to do with Lashon HaKodesh. That has to do with the subject matter and the style and what have you. But if a Jew who knows unfortunately nothing about Torah, if you show him a pasuk in Sefer Devarim, or in Sefer Yoshua, or in Sefer Shofatim, or in Sefer Shemuel, or Melachim, what have you, or Sefer Ezra, and he reads it and understands what it says, the basic import of what it says, that itself is proof that it's Lashon HaKodesh, especially if you're aware of the fact and you can prove that he understands no other language. Then obviously it has to be Lashon HaKodesh that he understands. Otherwise, unless you want to claim that the Tanakh is not Lashon HaKodesh, that doesn't seem like a reasonable claim to make. So I don't see how a person could make such a claim. And there are some Jews, I'm aware of this fact, who claim that it's improper to, or even asur, some of them might say, to speak Hebrew, because it's a holy tongue, it's Lashon HaKodesh, and it should only be used for holy pursuits, such as Torah and Tefillah, the Torah study and prayer. How would they deal with this statement that Rambam writes here, Devarim Shelachol, Mutar Le'omran, B'Lashon HaKodesh, B'Beit HaKiseh? He just said explicitly, you're allowed to discuss all manner of things in Hebrew. So this claim, which I'm aware of the fact that it exists in certain ideological circles, seems to be divorced from any authentic Torah source. It's also inane on a rational and historical level. I mean, what were Bnei Yisrael speaking in Eretz Yisrael in the time of Yoshua bin Nun, or in the time of Shimshon HaGibor, or in the time of David HaMelech, or any other of those periods to which you may wish to refer? What were they speaking when they discussed whatever they had to discuss in the marketplace, or how to defend themselves against this or that enemy, or whatever the case may be? Obviously, they were speaking Lashon HaKodesh. There might be certain individuals or groups or Hasidic sects who imagine that David HaMelech and his troops spoke in Yiddish, but I personally would find that somewhat unlikely suggestion, shall we say. Rambam goes on to say further, in other words, terms that are used to refer to Hashem, not the name of Hashem, but terms that are used to refer to Hashem, such as Keron, Rahum, Hanun, Ne'eman, in other words, any of these terms which we find which are used in the Tanakh to refer to Hashem as the merciful, Rahum, or Hanun, etc. Mutar Omran B'Beit HaKiseh. It is mutar to use these words, even though they are sometimes associated with Hashem, because they're not the name of Hashem. They're only used in a borrowed sense to refer to Hashem. Therefore, it's mutar to mention these terms anyway. Aval Hashemot HaMiyuchadim, however, the terms used to refer to Hashem specifically. Wahem Hashemot she'enim hakim. This refers to those names of Hashem which we learned in Hilchot Yisodei Torah. Names of Hashem that may not be erased. Asur la'azkiram b'Beit HaKiseh. These may not be mentioned in a Bet Kiseh or Bet HaMerchatz HaYashan. You can see in the text before you, it says Bet HaMerchatz instead of Merchas, which one can get away with perhaps, but Yashen instead of Yashan seems to me problematic, because in simple terms it means a Bet Merchatz which is asleep. rather than hayashan, which is then it has already been in use. So whether or not that is the masoreth of certain people, it doesn't seem reasonable to me. Okay. ואם נזדמן לו להפריש מדבר האסור בבית המרחץ, if it worked out that a person was in a Beth Mirchatz, in a public bathhouse, in a mikveh, and it became necessary to tell someone that such and such is asur, you should not do this thing, or בבית הכיסא, מפריש ואפילו בלשון הקודש ובענייני קודש. In other words, one can and does say what is necessary in that situation to be mafrish midavar ha'asur. In other words, to prevent, and here we see the importance of preventing a fellow Jew from transgressing that which is asur. So you see the idea of being mafrish misur, afroshe misura, the language of the Talmud in Aramaic, is a very important concept. Even in this situation, one is allowed to do so, even in Hebrew, and even using certain words which refer to the inyan at hand. It is correct and necessary to do so in that situation. So we shall end here for today. Be'ezrat Hashem. Hayu beruchim, חזקו ולמס לבבכם כל המייחלים לאדוני. שלום וניצחון על כל אויבינו מבית ומחוץ, ושהשם ישלח רפואה שלמה, רפואת הנפש והגוף, לכל חולי הגופות והנפשות גם כן. כל טוב, שלום שלום.